You are not quiet because you lack confidence, and you are not silent because you have nothing to say, and you are not choosing distance because you do not care. And if you have spent years wondering why words feel heavier in your mouth and thoughts feel in your mind, why silence feels like relief instead of absence, why listening feels safer than speaking, then this moment right now is not an accident. Because something in you has always known that quiet was never emptiness, it was protection. And psychology says that when the world feels unpredictable, the brain does not search for volume, it searches for safety. And for some people, safety sounds like stillness. It sounds like holding thoughts inside until they could be examined from every angle. It sounds like choosing presence without performance. And you may have been told that this makes you withdrawn or socially anxious or emotionally distant. But research shows that many quiet people are not avoiding connection, they're avoiding exposure. Because exposure once came with consequences, and your nervous system remembers this, even if your conscious mind does not. Because somewhere along the way, your brain learned that speaking up meant being misunderstood, interrupted, dismissed, corrected, or judged, and silence became the place where you could finally breathe. And this is not weakness, this is adaptation. This is how your brain learned to survive. And the reason silence feels safer than talking is not because you fear people, it is because your nervous system is tired of being on trial. And when you sit in a room full of voices and feel your energy slowly draining, it is not because you lack social skills. It is because your system is scanning for threat while others are scanning for stimulation. And you have likely spent years trying to fix this part of you, trying to speak more, talk faster, be louder, be lighter, be easier, wondering why it never feels natural and why every conversation feels like work. And the truth that psychology keeps circling back to is that some minds are built for depth before display, and some nervous systems learned early that quiet was the only place where they were not asked to defend themselves. And if you have ever felt guilty for needing silence, or ashamed for preferring listening, or confused about why words feel safer on paper than in the air, then you're not broken. You are responding exactly as your experience has taught you to respond. And understanding this is where healing actually begins. At its core, this is not a story about shyness or introversion or communication skills. It is a story about trust, about how the brain decides whether a moment is safe enough to speak. And psychology says that speech is not just a social behavior, it is a vulnerability behavior. Because when you speak, you reveal thoughts, intentions, emotions, and identity. And if your past taught you that revealing yourself led to pain, your nervous system will naturally slow that process down and choose silence instead. And this is not something you consciously decide. It is something that happens before words even reach your throat. And research shows that the brain prioritizes survival over expression every time, which means if silence once kept you safe, it will continue to feel safer even when danger is no longer present. And this creates an inner conflict where part of you wants to connect and another part of you wants to disappear, and neither part is wrong. They're simply responding to different timelines. And this video is not about forcing yourself to talk more or convincing yourself that silence is bad. It is about understanding why silence became home and how that understanding slowly turns safety into choice rather than reflex. Because when you understand the psychology behind your quiet, you stop fighting yourself and start listening to what your nervous system has been trying to tell you all along. One of the most misunderstood aspects of silence is that it is often mistaken for fear when in reality, it is frequently the result of heightened awareness, and psychology calls this sensory processing sensitivity, which means your brain takes in more information from your environment than average. And when you are in conversation, you're not just hearing words, you're reading tone, facial expressions, pauses, shifts in energy and emotional undercurrents. And all of this processing requires mental resources, and research shows that when cognitive load increases, the brain naturally reduces output to conserve energy, which means talking less is not avoidance, it is regulation. And if you have ever left a conversation feeling mentally exhausted, even though you barely spoke, it is because your brain was working overtime and silence was the only way to prevent overload. And this is why small talk feels especially draining, because it offers little meaning but demands constant response, and your system does not see the payoff. And psychology says that when effort outweighs reward, the brain disengages, and for you, disengagement looks like quiet. And This often starts early in life when a child realizes that listening keeps them safe, keeps them out of trouble, keeps them from being corrected or laughed at or misunderstood, and over time this listening becomes a skill of strength even. But because our culture rewards verbal assertiveness, this strength is often mislabeled as insecurity, and the result is that you begin to doubt your natural rhythm and try to override it, which creates anxiety, not because silence is wrong, but because self-betrayal always feels wrong. And when you force yourself to speak before you are ready, your nervous system experiences it as threat and reacts with tension, hesitation, and mental blankness. And then you blame yourself instead of recognizing that your system is simply asking for more time and more safety. In psychology, says that time is one of the most overlooked needs of sensitive minds. And when you give yourself permission to take its silence, stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling like information. Another layer to this experience comes from what psychology calls learned inhibition, which develops when expressing thoughts or emotions was once met with negative consequences. And this does not require extreme trauma. It can come from subtle repeated experiences like being interrupted, dismissed, teased, or corrected, or even praised only when you were agreeable and quiet. And over time, the brain connects speech with risk and silence with control, and this creates an internal rule that says it is better to think than to say, better to observe than to participate, better to stay invisible than to be exposed. And this rule operates quietly, shaping your behavior without asking your permission. And research shows that once a behavior successfully reduces discomfort, the brain reinforces it, which means every time silence kept you safe, it became more appealing. And this is why even in supportive environments, you may still hesitate, because your nervous system does not update based on logic. It updates based on experience, and until it has enough experiences where speaking leads to safety rather than harm, it will continue to choose quiet. And this does not mean you are stuck. It means your system is cautious, and psychology says caution is intelligence shaped by experience. And if you have ever wondered why you can speak freely with a few trusted people but shut down in groups or unfamiliar settings, it is because your brain has categorized those spaces differently. One feels safe enough for expression, the other does not. And this selective silence is not dysfunction, it is discernment. And the mistake is assuming that the solution is to override it rather than understand it. Because when you respect your system, it becomes more flexible, and when you fight it, it becomes more rigid. There is also a deeper emotional component to silence that psychology often connects to identity development. Because when you grow up feeling unseen or misunderstood, you learn to build a rich inner world where your thoughts are safe and unchallenged, and this inner world becomes a refuge, a place where you can explore ideas without interruption, and over time you may begin to value this inner space more than external validation, and research shows that people with strong inner worlds often prefer depth over breadth, meaning they would rather have one meaningful conversation than 10 surface-level ones, and this preference is not antisocial. It is selective, and silence becomes the gateway to that depth because it allows you to stay connected to yourself even when the external world feels chaotic. And this is why talking for the sake of talking feels empty to you, because it pulls you away from your center. And psychology says that authenticity requires alignment between inner experience and outer expression. And when the environment does not support that alignment, silence becomes the most honest response. And this honesty is often mistaken for disengagement when it is actually integrity. And if you have ever felt more present while listening than while speaking, it is because listening allows you to stay grounded in your internal state, while speaking requires you to manage both internal and external demands simultaneously. And your nervous system may simply prefer the former. And this preference is not something to cure, it is something to honor and understand. Another important concept here is nervous system regulation, because silence often functions as a self-calming mechanism, and psychology shows that when the nervous system detects potential threat, it activates either fight, flight, or freeze, and silence is closely associated with the freeze response, not in a pathological sense, but as a way to conserve energy and avoid escalation. And if you grew up in environments where speaking up led to conflict or emotional intensity, your system may have learned that quiet prevents chaos, and this pattern can persist into adulthood where even mild social tension triggers the same response. and your body goes still, your mind goes quiet, and words disappear. And this can feel frustrating because intellectually you know you are safe, but your body does not operate on intellect, it operates on memory. And research shows that the body remembers emotional patterns long after the mind has moved on. And this is why telling yourself to just speak up rarely works, because the issue is not confidence, it is regulation. And until your nervous system feels safe enough, words will remain inaccessible. And this is not a flaw, it is a signal. And psychology says signals are invitations to understand, not commands to override. And when you learn to read this signal, you can begin to work with your system rather than against it, and slowly expand your capacity for expression without forcing its silence. Also becomes safer when you have a strong sense of responsibility for how your words affect others. And psychology calls this high empathy, and people with high empathy often pause before speaking because they are considering impact, tone, timing, and emotional consequences, and this constant consideration can make spontaneous speech feel risky because you do not want to harm, misunderstand, or overwhelm. And research shows that empathic individuals often experience decision fatigue in social interactions because they are weighing multiple variables at once, and silence becomes a way to reduce that load. And this is why you may feel more comfortable writing than speaking, because writing allows time for refinement and reduces the risk of unintended impact. And this preference is not avoidance, it is care. The problem arises when this care turns inward and you begin to judge yourself for not being more expressive. And psychology says that self-judgment increases anxiety, which further inhibits speech, creating a cycle that reinforces silence. And the way out of this cycle is not to eliminate empathy, but to include yourself in it, to recognize that your need for safety matters just as much as others' need for clarity. And when you do this, silence becomes a choice rather than a cage. As this pattern continues, over time, silence can become part of your identity, and you may start to believe that this is just who you are, the quiet one, the observer, the listener. And while there is nothing wrong with these roles, psychology warns against identity fusion, where behavior becomes mistaken for the self, because when this happens, change feels like betrayal, and even the desire to speak more can trigger guilt or confusion. And research shows that identities formed around coping strategies can limit growth if they are not re-examined. And this does not mean abandoning silence. It means loosening the grip of labels and allowing yourself to be fluid and sometimes expressive and sometimes quiet without attaching moral value to either. And this flexibility is what psychology associates with resilience. And the more you understand that silence was something you learned, not something you are, the more freedom you gain to choose differently when it feels right. And the key here is choice, not pressure, because pressure recreates the conditions that made silence necessary in the first place. And your nervous system knows this and resists accordingly. When you begin to integrate these insights, something subtle shifts, because you stop asking what is wrong with me and start asking what happened to me. And psychology says this shift from self-blame to self-inquiry is one of the most healing moves a person can make. And as you reflect, you may notice patterns, moments where you were talked over, moments where your words were twisted, moments where being quiet felt easier than explaining yourself. And as you see these patterns with compassion, you begin to realize silence was never the enemy, it was the messenger, and it carried you through situations you were not ready to face directly. And now, as an adult, you may have more resources, more autonomy, more safety, and your system may be ready to update, but updates require patience and repeated experiences of safety. And this means starting small, choosing environments and people where you feel seen, practicing expression in ways that feel controlled and reversible, like writing or one-on-one conversations, and allowing yourself to retreat when needed without shame. And research shows that gradual exposure paired with self-compassion is far more effective than forced change. And as you practice this, you may notice that silence begins to feel less rigid, less compulsory, and more spacious. And within that space, words start to emerge naturally, not because you forced them, but because they were finally invited. It is also important to recognize that silence does not need to be justified to be valid, and psychology emphasizes that not every behavior needs to be optimized for productivity or social approval. And some people are simply wired to process internally before externally, And this wiring contributes to creativity, insight, and emotional depth, and research consistently shows that reflective individuals often excel in areas that require patience, nuance, and long-term thinking, and these strengths are not always visible in fast-paced conversations, but they shape the world in quieter ways. And when you stop trying to compete in arenas that do not suit your nervous system, you free up energy to invest in places that do. And this is not withdrawal, it is alignment. And alignment is where confidence actually grows, because confidence is not loudness, it is congruence between who you are and how you live. And when you honor your relationship with silence, you stop seeing it as a flaw and start seeing it as a foundation. As we bring all of this together, it becomes clear that silence feels safer than talking, not because you're afraid of being heard, but because your brain learned that quiet was the most reliable way to stay regulated, connected, and intact. And this learning. Why does silence feel safer than talking for some people? This psychology-based video explores quiet minds and nervous system responses. Was adaptive at the time, and it deserves respect and gratitude rather than criticism. And psychology says that healing does not require erasing old strategies, it requires updating them. And this update happens when you feel safe enough to experiment, when you trust yourself enough to listen to your limits, and when you allow expression to unfold at its own pace. And the more you practice this, the more you realize that silence and speech are not opposites, they are partners in communication, and both have their place. And when you stop forcing one over the other, you find a rhythm that feels authentic and sustainable, and that rhythm is uniquely yours. So if you've spent years feeling out of place in a loud world, if you have questioned your worth because you did not speak as quickly or as often as others, if you have wondered whether something was missing inside, you let this be the moment you stop asking those questions and start offering yourself understanding. Because you were never broken, you were learning, and you are still learning, and the safety you found in silence was real, and it mattered. And now you get to decide how much of it you still need and how much space you want to make for your voice. And there's no deadline for this, no standard to meet, no personality to perform. There's only you and your nervous system and the ongoing conversation between them. And when you listen to that conversation with kindness, you begin to realize that silence was never the absence of confidence. It was the presence of wisdom waiting for the right moment to speak. If this reflection resonated with you, if you felt seen or understood in these words, consider staying with this channel, because this space is designed for minds that move quietly and deeply. And if you want to support this work, you can like the video to help it reach others who need this message, and subscribe if you want more psychology-based reflections that validate rather than fix. And if you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Not because you have to speak, but because sometimes choosing to be heard on your own terms is part of the healing too. And remember, there is nothing wrong with you for finding safety in silence, and there is no rush to leave it until you are ready.